Okay. So thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Ambassador, and thanks, everyone, for your amazing remarks. We're very happy to be here today. Thank you. We will start off our discussions today about how climate change affects gender with a panel of amazing and very experienced experts on the subject. So I will be reading my notes because all your titles are very impressive. So I'll asking Mrs. Dimadama Zefi, Senior Research Fellow of Department of International European and Area Studies at Pantheon University, to join me. Hi, Zefi. Zefi, Jessie Catherine Thompson, Head of Delegation at the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being here. You're sitting next to me. Maria Sijoglu, Urban Designer and Participatory Planning Expert. Thank you also for being here with us. And Vruce Vekkar, MD, he will be joining us. Oh, here you are. Hi. MD, Women's Health Physician, Fellow at Climate for Health, Eco-America, and member of the editorial board, Journal of Climate Change and Health. Hope I said that everything right. Thank you for joining us, and I will be seeing you from there. So, Stella mentioned baseline, and at the opening remarks, almost everyone mentioned that we need to know why. And so, Jessie, welcome, and thank you for being here. We need an explainer. We need to set the base. So why are we having this conversation today? How is climate, how are natural disasters? Let's talk about this specifically. So how are natural disasters and extreme weather conditions actually affecting gender and women?
Well, I'm so grateful to be here to speak to this topic because it's a topic that's very close to my heart and one that's all too often forgotten. The International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies is a membership organization, and we're made up of 192 national Red Cross and Red Crescent societies around the world. And we are a diverse and varied network, but the reality of how gender plays out and how gender dynamics play out in disasters repeats itself country over country, disaster over disaster. And somehow as a humanitarian community, we're still grappling with this question. So it's a really important topic. Disasters affect men, women, boys, and girls differently, not surprisingly. We all know that about our own communities, about our own families. We have different needs, we have different capacities, and crises affect us all differently. And very often, communities are impacted by disasters differently according to their power, their social status, their roles, their caregiving roles, even whether or not they have a seat at the table when it comes to decision making. And so women and girls are all too often finding themselves with increased vulnerability in disasters because of social norms, because of the roles that they play in society, and because of their access to resources and power. And when we think about it in numbers, when a disaster strikes, women and children are 14 times more likely than men to die. Out of the 230,000 people who died, who were killed in the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, 70% were women. So it's driven by a lot of different factors. And those needs that are different in times of crisis are sadly a little too often overlooked. And we talked a little bit about data in the beginning of this conversation. And one of the most important things that we try to do as the Red Cross in times of disaster is actually collect data that is disaggregated by sex and by age. Because if you don't have the numbers, if you don't know the needs of the people that you serve, it's pretty hard to ensure that you meet those needs as part of the response. But you better have a gender balanced team to collect that information, because if you send in a team of men to a community who only talk to the men in the community, you can be pretty sure that the picture of the needs that you will have will be very different. Actually, I have a great example, and then I'll give space to others to speak. We were responding to a cyclone that had hit a community, and we were there talking to the elected community elders about the needs in the community. They were all men, and we were asking about...
That was not a tough guess.
Yeah, exactly. And we were asking about, the needs and what the specific needs were, and we were saying, and tell us a little bit about how women are part of the response. And they said to us, they're not involved in this reconstruction effort. And behind this sort of group of men sitting under the tree, there were 4 women on a ladder patching the house behind us. And so, we're sort of like, oh, okay, let's talk about that a little bit more. But it is those sort of dynamics that drive a response. And all too often, humanitarian responses then bring a gender-blind response that leaves out those specific needs and vulnerabilities and leaves women behind, and particularly the most vulnerable women who might have other reasons that they're excluded in terms of race, ethnicity, age, religion within their community, and that really needs to be part of how we understand needs. Otherwise, those folks are left behind.
Thank you so much and for your answer. I think we laid down a very good base of why we're talking about this, and we are starting off this conversation, and we will be having more and more of these conversations in the future. It is very important for us at Women on Top to actually collect the data you mentioned. So I'm giving the floor to Zefi. Zefi, we work together on climate and gender in the Mediterranean and Greece area, a research initiative of Women on Top that was implemented with the help of and the support of Sustainably We and EKPEC. And I'm sorry if I didn't mention anyone, but we were a lot of partners in the research. So Zefi, can you briefly, the research had 2 parts. So we first, at the 3rd Inclusivity Lounge, we mentioned, we announced the results of the first part of the research. And can you tell us more about that, the scope of the research of the first part and some main findings?
Thank you so much, and I'd like to thank very much Ambassador of US that joined us, my friend and a very good Secretary General, Ms. Kalypso Goula. We have worked together in a lot of gender equality issue, and of course, Women on Top, Stella, and all of you, that we are here, and we try to find out what's happening really in the issues of climate change and gender. And it's not for luck that we are in red, because it's an emergency issue for climate crisis for women, and it's a passion that we need to work in this issue, especially women. Because when we start working in Pantheon University with EKPEC, our institution, about this research, it was really interesting that we know what's happening with other articles and from our research in European and not only level, that women are more sensitive in the issues of environment. They have a lot of the climate crisis affects more women, and in a different way in the health issue. We're more sensitive in the issues of breathing, of cancer. Unfortunately, we are more valuable when we are work because of the climate crisis, especially in the issues of tourism, especially in the issues of agricultural. The more and more women work there without any security, are in a, in a frog area of labor, unfortunately, especially in Mediterranean, because I'd like to mention a few things about Mediterranean that coming up in our research. And of course, because in South Europe and in North Africa, in Mediterranean area, we thought from our service and our estimation that we are not in the first line of the climate crisis and climate changes. Unfortunately, everything coming up to down and down to up. That means changes everything. We think that in 10 or 20 years, we will have more and more emergency issues in the issues of food security, of energy issues. Unfortunately, in water saving, we're going to face crisis in the water saving, and women are very crucial, our role in the manage the issues of our house and energy and water issue for our family, for our labor. And we have also a problem with the head. We're going to have a lot of increasing of temperature. Now we have 5-6 days that we have about 35 in Greece, and not only Greece, in Spain, in Italy also, 35 to 40 degrees. Unfortunately, in a few years, we're going to have about 20 days, day by day, about 40 and 40 plus degrees. That means that it will be very difficult to work, to live in our countries, and to have a lot of problem in our economy. Unfortunately, the climate crisis has sex. It's more vulnerable women in the issues of the climate crisis, and it's something that more sensitive and more people influence in a negative way from the climate crisis, especially in Mediterranean, and not only in Mediterranean. That means that we need to be, it is really interesting just because I think we have limited time and I don't want to say...
We always have limited time for this kind of discussions.
Fortunately. We will have the next question that we're going to find some issues specific about what our survey focus on. But I like to say that it's really important for us that women are more sensitive of the climate change, on the environmental issues, and about the energy and water saving. And this is really crucial. The bad thing is that women think that we don't know a lot of things about that, and maybe men has to be the leaders in the issues of environment and climate crisis.
We'll
and
talk about
unfortunately, when we are in a Mati, in this wild, the huge fire, we have a lot of grandmothers with the children there to stay in the Mati area. Most of these women say that we know what to do, we know some saving ways, but we wait for the men to say what to do. And this is unbelievable, because this costs lives. But most of course, this is the first thing. The other thing is that we need to feel that we are power, and we can lead, and we know more than what we think, because this is exactly the stereotype. And I stop here, yes? Thank you.
Thank you for this initial briefing on the scope of the first part of the research. Can we have Bruce on the screen? Because I want to first confirm that he can hear us. Okay. So thank you for dedicating the time to being with us today. And I know you've been engaged with climate crisis since 2007, and a lot of your work and research has to do with how climate impacts pregnancies. So can you talk to us a little bit about your research and how it is related to what we're talking about today?
Yes, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. It is a pleasure to join you. I wish it could have been in person. This is an amazing panel and a very important audience. I should have a disclaimer first off, and that is that I am not a medical researcher per se. I have done some research, but I'm primarily a clinician. I did pap smears and delivered babies for 30 years. but I've been a full-time climate activist since 2013. We ended up getting involved in doing this research focusing on specifically pregnant women and birth outcomes. And that fits into the larger conversation about women and vulnerability and climate change. But this all started back in 2015 when the American Academy of Pediatrics put out a very important technical report about the vulnerability of children to the impacts of climate change. And it was a big picture analysis of that vulnerability. And within that paper was a quote from the World Health Organization saying that over 85% of the disease burden of climate change would fall on children under the age of 5. And that certainly got a lot of our attention. Anyway, not being a researcher, I pulled together a team of people I knew from other folks who were actual medical researchers, and we decided to look at the question whether or not climate change was actually affecting births. And we chose to focus on the US, not because it's more vulnerable than other places, but because so often in this country, people were making the excuse that climate change was not a problem in the US. Anyway, it took from 2016 until 2019, basically, to review over 1,800 studies. We looked at references worldwide, and we ended up focusing on very common exposures tied to climate change, air pollution, and heat. And we found 68 studies that met our criteria, and out of those 68, 57 found a very, very strong association between those common exposures, again, air pollutants tied to climate change and heat, and the adverse birth outcomes of premature birth, low birth weight, and stillbirth. With heat, there were 9 of 10 studies showing that association. With air pollution, 48 out of 57. This was a review paper, and it didn't establish that climate change was causing these birth impacts, because that's a difficult step to get to. But we feel like it's very likely that this is a cause and effect relationship because, first of all, there have been a number of mechanisms that have been identified for how certain exposures like heat or air pollution could trigger a premature birth and those other outcomes. But also there were a large variety of research approaches used to look at the same question, which basically all came to the same conclusion. Now, another of our key findings that we didn't go looking for was that outcomes were generally worse for minority moms in the US, that Black women, even more so than Latinas, were more likely to have premature birth or low birth weight babies or even stillbirths. And this was primarily tied to air pollution exposure. It's also consistent with something we've known for a long time, which is that Black women in America are 3 times more likely to die during pregnancy than white women are. So it's all rather consistent. Our findings were actually published in June of 2020, which was the height of the Black Lives Matter movement in the US. So it helped us to get a lot of visuals, a lot of media coverage of our findings. It's important to point out that lots of other studies have come out since our paper was published in June of 2020. Our paper itself has been cited more than 130 times. But what those papers have done by and large is to reinforce our findings, to give more weight to them, to cover other countries in particular that also seem to be struggling with these same sorts of associations. But we're also starting to see when during pregnancy are the most vulnerable times, which locations in the US and what times of year and what stages of pregnancy are the most vulnerable. And I just want to say a moment about, I want to say one thing for a moment about the title of this panel today. We're talking about natural disasters. I think maybe it's time that we stopped using the term natural, because it seems like so many of these extreme weather events there's such a large human footprint on them that we've been calling them unnatural disasters for some time. And also, I think we have to realize that extreme weather conditions include not just the superstorms and massive heat waves that unfortunately are becoming more common, but it's also things like elevated nighttime temperatures and just warm spells, warmer than usual. And the fact that heat and air pollution are tightly tied together. We know that heat increases ozone levels, and also we're seeing many more fires, which is certainly a major producer of air pollution. So I think that those are learnings from our own research that might apply to this conversation today.
Thank you, Bruce, for all these interesting insights and data. Note taken about the natural disasters. And I think it's very important that you stressed out. You also talked about intersectionality, and it's what you Jesse mentioned before, that it's gender, it's race, it's a class, it's where you work, it's where you live. Everything affects the way climate crisis has its impact on its community and country. So Maria, and it was great that Bruce mentioned about not only heat waves but high temperatures as well. So I want us to go into the urban context, and we know most of us here live in big urban centers, and the way of our living is not easy. An extreme weather condition is not making it any easier. Now, I'm going to be talking with Zefi about this more into detail later, but the second part of our research, in the second part of our research, women identified 3 main factors that made their life in urban spaces more difficult. And that was, these were heat waves, and extreme weather conditions, like high temperatures, more high temperatures, and also wildfires, and Zefi mentioned that before as well. So can you talk to us a bit about the challenges that women face in living in big urban centers?
Yes. First of all, I would like to thank you as well for inviting me in this very interesting panel on such an important topic and such a pressing issue, the climate change, like we are experiencing in, I might say, like every second week, we might have something that reminds us that there is a change, and climate is changing, and we need to adapt. And being an urban designer, I can bring to the table the perspective from urban planning. And I would like to, first of all, say that I'm sure that you might all agree that our cities are not resilient to the climate change. So there is lots of work to be done there. And on the other hand, I see many women here, and we might all experience that cities are not designed based on women, how women use the city today, with all the multiple roles that we might have in society, being a professional, being a mother, or being any role we might take. So I think that climate change is only here to exacerbate this inequality that we already know. And to maybe bring an example and make it more tangible, more personal, I would say that, for example, a week ago in Thessaloniki, we had flood. Major streets were flooded because of intense rainfall, and we have those floods really frequently. And just imagine a mother having to pick up her child from childcare through flooded streets. Well, that's impossible. And we're talking about a really urbanized area, right? Not a rural area. So any disruption that might be caused through, caused by climate change impacts, like different types, either a heat wave or a flooding or even a fire, actually the burden is actually carried to women who have a specific role, who have specific responsibilities. We have, based on climate, because of climate change, we have disruptions in utility networks. For example, we have electricity cuts or water scarcity, and we understand that many women, if I would say the majority, not to be very rigid, but they do have the responsibilities of the household and what those energy cuts might mean to their schedule. Women, research shows that they're using public transport more than men do, and public transportation is primarily affected by any disruptions that might be caused in the urban environment. So yes, I would say from the urban perspective that women are way more affected than men do, because women use the city in many different ways and use the city a lot more, I would like to say, because we might say that now at the moment how cities are built, and mainly in Greece, let's focus on Greece, they are, not only cities, but also the facilities and the services are based on an average man working 9 to 5 for a job like that. But women have completely different needs. And I think that we're going to jump into this topic, how we include women in this whole planning process. But it's important to highlight how differently in our everyday lives we experience all the different causes that we have from climate change. Not to mention the heat wave. Let's move forward to that.
It's very important and interesting what you said about how we women use the city, because if I may add, the way we use the city also affects a lot, many more members of the community of our city, because we are the main caretaker. So if we need to go to the supermarket, or if we need to call the doctor, that affects the whole family or our caretaking responsibilities. So thank you for pointing that out. And Zefi, picking up from where we left, in the second part of our research, we tried to find out the opinions as well as the experiences of women in regards to climate crisis and sustainability. So what was interesting, one of the findings that we found interesting is that women think that they are very well, they know terms, more mainstream terms that have to do with sustainability and climate crisis, like, for example, green products. So we know all these terms, but it seems that our knowledge, our literacy of other newer, let's say, terms like cyclical economy and energy poverty and sustainable development, and all these new, in quotes, terms we are not familiar with. And my question to you is, why do you think that is? And who is responsible to cover this gap?
Yes, this is really interesting. So I think that not only women, but men and women are not familiar with some of these words and phrases. Because, first of all, of the COVID pandemic, because we focus on another issues, but the key here is that the climate crisis connected with the COVID somehow, and this is something that we need to discuss and in another discussion, maybe not today. Another issue is that, unfortunately, when we talk about the effects of the climate change, are more easier for us to recognize the hazard, the natural hazard, the droughts, the really hot weather. It is not easy for us to say that now we have green jobs. What are green jobs? Sustainability. My second book is about the sustainable development and the 17 goals. And I have my students that, not most of them, but there was a lot of my students that they say, what is this 17 goals? We don't know this term. We know what the issues, we know that we need to work in the gender equality, in the climate crisis, in the water saving, in the power, reducing of power of poor people, and all these things, but we don't know the terms. That means that we need to work more in this issue, and to have what we say more and more, we need to have a governance, not government. We need to work between different stakeholders, we say in our science. That means that we need to discuss with the local authority, that from my part, this is another key. We need to work the local and regional authority that are very close to the people, more than the ministers and what we do in the central politics, with universities, with NGOs, and with networks that work not only in the climate change or women issue, gender issue, This is another issue that we have to work on. The 17 goals is a roadmap. We need to interconnect all these different issues under the same umbrella. It's not a separate thing. Gender equality, climate crisis, water, poor people, and I don't know, the renewable energy issue. We need to interconnect. All these things is under the same umbrella. And this is the key. This is what we have to work with local authority, with the universities, and women especially, because this is coming up from our research, is that maybe they don't know what sustainability is, but they are very interesting to know. They are very open to understand what this is thing, how I can participate with that, because they want to open their minds. They are more open to the new, to the change, to the technology and the innovation, let's say, issue. Are more flexible. They have a lot of things to do. Yes, I'm sorry for that. We do a lot of things every day, like mothers, like daughters, and whatever. So it's easier for us to interconnect all these different things. I'm stopping here.
Thank you,
Sorry.
Zephy. It's just that we have limited time, as you said before, and I want to give the space to the other three panelists. And because everything is interconnected, and we talked about how gender is affected from natural disasters and extreme weather conditions, and we talked about reproductive health. And I want you, Jessie, to talk to us about how these two are connected with violence against women and girls. How are these two affecting violence, gender-based violence?
It's a really important question, and I think when we think about the gender-specific needs of women and girls in disasters, we do think of things like menstrual hygiene. Any of us who are women think of it at least. We think about reproductive needs, because just because there's a disaster doesn't make you no longer pregnant, and it doesn't mean you no longer need the services if you're pregnant. It also, people still get pregnant following disasters. So those things come, I think, to mind quite quickly. What's maybe more invisible is the increase in gender-based violence that often accompanies a disaster. And that's not just sexual violence in the form of assault or sexual abuse or exploitation, but it's also domestic violence. Intimate partner violence increases in disasters. The Red Cross conducted a study on gender-based violence in 2015 in a number of natural disaster responses, looking at incidents of GBV, and indeed there was a fairly consistent evidence of increase in gender-based violence. The data is really weak for all the same reasons that data on gender-based violence is complicated, because of sensitivities around reporting, stigma. It's further complicated in disasters because law enforcement is disrupted. They're focused on civil protection duties, on doing the basics from a disaster response perspective, and very often are not available or not able to cope with dealing with issues linked to intimate partner violence or domestic violence or sexual assault or exploitation. And the conditions of disasters also just make everything ripe for violence. Camps are overcrowded, shelters are overcrowded, bathrooms might not have locks on the doors or have inappropriate lighting. People are with either strangers without the usual protection mechanisms that would be in place to keep them safe, or they're trapped with their violent partner in inappropriate housing. So it's a very
similar
serious
to what
issue.
happened during COVID, right?
Indeed, and that was the shadow pandemic. It was absolutely the reality that played out in the context of COVID as well. And somehow we find ourselves surprised by it every time. But there's lots that can be done to tackle gender-based violence in disasters, to be better prepared for it as a consequence of disasters, and to make sure that the supports are in place so that women can get help, can get seek justice, can get care when it comes to health care, as well as psychosocial support and all of those other supports. But you can't take a gender-blind approach. You can't assume that there are no gender-specific needs and hope that that's going to happen. And that's why everything we're talking about today is so important.
And I would love to have time for a third round about, and talking about gender-blind responses and how we can change that. But we can all leave this room with this question in our heads and maybe go change that at work tomorrow morning. So Bruce, if I could have Bruce with us again. So what can we do? I want to talk with Maria later about what authorities can do or what can municipalities do. But your and your team's work about women and how climate crisis affects pregnancies, what can we do as women to ask or demand from authorities to change? What would your, not suggestion, but your insights would be?
Well, first of all, I think we've established for all the reasons today from all the panelists that climate change truly does make women an endangered gender. And so protection of women has to be prioritized both individually and also across society. As individuals, I think it's important all of us, and women in particular, become aware of the specific risks of where you live. In some places, heat is a bigger problem, fires, droughts, extreme storms, infectious disease. These are all risks that are not only present now, but are going to continue to grow. So making plans at this time to deal with them and to start preparing. There's information, I'm sure, on local websites, or you could just Google how to deal with heat waves or what sorts of ways we can approach drought and things like that, and start preparing. You can make changes to your home. You can find out where cooling centers are and make sure that you're near one of them if you need to be. There are air quality monitoring apps that people can download to their phones that can send them alerts. This is really important not only for women, especially the vulnerable groups like pregnant women we've been talking about, but also remember that your children are vulnerable too to these changes and more vulnerable than average people. Particularly if they have asthma or things like that. But there's only so much that we can do individually. I certainly think that the response to our paper with the massive media response and also the interest in the medical community tells us that people do care about these impacts on pregnant moms and their babies. And we've been pushing the idea that we need to talk more about pregnant bellies and less about polar bears, because although we all love and care about most animals in nature, we can really relate to women and babies, and as I say, the response lets us know that people really are interested. So sharing this information, sharing the data that's been coming out in studies about impacts is a way of getting people's attention. And it's not just to protect women, frankly. It's very obvious as an obstetrician that we know that if women aren't doing well in society, it impacts us all. Certainly elected officials at all levels must start dealing with this more aggressively, and they need to hear from you. I've been involved in my local region in terms of going to city council meetings and things like that, and I can tell you that elected officials are very interested to hear from their constituents, and in particular, I think women coming in who are talking about their pregnancies and their babies is a very compelling message. So I would urge you to get organized with other women in a similar area where you live, or to join local environmental groups or climate change groups and begin to participate. The specific asks, again, depend upon the risks where you are, but certainly we need more renewable energy. We need plans to deal with extreme heat. Elected officials can help with that. I know there's a program that's being ramped up in Barcelona where they are making the network of cooling centers available to everybody, so no one's more than 5 minutes away from a cooling center, regardless of where they are within the city. Local governments can help with retrofits and helping people switch gas appliances to electric appliances in the home, and certainly to vote. It really should be a test of people's fitness for office, whether or not they see climate change as an urgent issue and are willing to act on it aggressively. And remember, what you're asking for will not only help stop the climate crisis, but will provide pretty much immediate health benefits for everybody, vulnerable groups in particular, but for everyone. Remember how well nature responded during the early pandemic, how quickly it came back to cleaner air and fresher water. So these are all goals that appeal to everyone.
Thank you, Bruce. I'm keeping one of your last comments as a reminder and stressing out that we are entering an elections year in Greece. So voting is very, very important, and it's applicable to all communities, all countries, everywhere in the world. So thank you. Maria, we have 3 minutes for you to tell us how we're talking about innovative solutions, and I'm reading a quote, one of your quotes. You said, developing innovative solutions for climate adaptation is one thing, but implementing such solutions in the complex urban context is a whole other challenging task. So you have now 2.5 minutes to explain to us what's the biggest challenge there through the gender lens, and how we can, not get over it, but work with it.
Well, I take the challenge of being brief. Yeah, I think that Bruce also mentioned the word participation, and I'm going to elaborate further on this. And yes, to develop climate adaptation solutions for urban planning is a scientific-based, probably, task. Like, we have come up with different solutions, and but in order to apply them to urban contexts that are so different from place to place, with not only the differences, environmental differences, but also social differences, economical differences. And in order to implement a solution that can be effective and sustainable in the long term, you need to establish participation processes. Like, if you are a local authority, or if you are the coordinator of any type of solution, and I'm not going to get into details because we don't have time, but you need to keep in mind that in order to have a sustainable investment, because you're actually spending money on this, you need to hear from the actual users, and mainly women, other groups as well. Let's not forget that, like children or other minorities are excluded, usually excluded from this process. But let's talk about women. We said that they are using the city through, with different roles. They're using the city differently than men do. And also, they have very limited time. So it doesn't mean if a local authority says that, okay, I'm doing this big, massive urban regeneration plan, that I'm taking the perspective of climate adaptation, and I'm doing 2 public consultations. Well, this is not the way to do it. You need to actually establish, like, invest time and effort and resources to establish a communication channel with your users, to find them in their place, and to give them the appropriate type of information, why and how they can actually be part of it. You cannot ask every user, every citizen, every woman to actually just spend devote some time of their very limited time to just come to the city hall and say what they want, they would like the city to be like. This is not the way to go. And I hope that someone from local authorities is here hearing us, but there needs to be a specific coordinated effort to reach out to those groups and completely understand what the needs are, and keep communicating while the project is being completed and by the end of it. Because we know that conditions are changing, we are changing, so we need to adapt to the new conditions. I hope that was a clear message, and we can further elaborate later.
I think it was for me, and I hope it was for everyone here. So thank you all 4 of you so much for joining this conversation and sharing your expertise and knowledge and experience and data. We have a lot of things, but we don't have a lot of time. So thank you so much, and I'm inviting on stage Consul General Elizabeth K. Lee and U.S. Consul General in Thessaloniki to continue the conversation.